Hi everybody. I'd like to do a presentation about managing honeybees. And you're seeing, which is great because really there's no need to be watching me talk. Instead, it's time to talk about, and I have to go to slideshow from the beginning. All right, inspecting and planning. Oh, supposed to be there, wrong slide. There we go. Your hive is going through a phase. Isn't this a fun picture? This is in the fall. And these are aster flowers, and there's some out there. And I actually don't use this as a hive stand anymore, and that wasn't an actual operating hive, but it looks cool. Phases could your hive be going through? It could be a startup. It's queenright. And once it gets going, it grows quickly. An example would be a package or a nuke. If you make a split or catch a swarm, all of those are great examples of a startup that's queenright. Or it could be a startup and your hive swarm. It's not yet queenright, losing population daily, or maybe gaining population if some brood is emerging, but it's not going to be growing quickly, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Another phase it could be in is doomed. The population will slowly dwindle. There is no queen, no hope of a queen, but you would be surprised how long those bees can hang on for. The last phase your hive could be in is mature, at its maximum. So your queen is still laying a lot of eggs. You'll see, 8 frames with brood. The population is not increasing. This means for every bee that's born, one is dying. Your hive can lose 1,000 to 2,000 bees a day. But a mature hive, input and output are balanced, and a mature hive is capable of making honey. Look at this frame of capped brood. Isn't it possible to tell from this? What stage is this hive in? Oh, it could be a startup that's queenright or a startup that's not yet queenright. What? Well, if you have a hive that swarmed, there were eggs and young larvae left behind, or maybe just young larvae. In 2 weeks before the queen starts laying, you're going to have capped brood in there. The queen laid those eggs, 20 days ago. This doesn't mean that your hive is queenright. The population will increase, but it may not continue increasing. This could also be from a doomed hive. That virgin queen may have flown yesterday and didn't make it back, eaten by a bird. That capped brood will emerge, but there's no eggs or larvae left to start over with. Or it could even be from, of course, we would see this in a mature hive. So you have to take a lot of care with interpreting what phase your hive is in from what you're seeing on the frames. We'll talk about that in a minute. All right. Oh, here's another situation. Oh, look at all those bees. This just frame to frame, wall to wall, covered with bees. It could be a startup that's not yet queenright. What? Yeah, if you have a hive that swarmed, but there were 5 frames with brood. In 2 weeks, those 5 frames of brood emerge and become 10 frames covered with bees. Your box can be really full if they swarmed the day after you inspected. You don't look for 10 days, wait 10 days between inspections. You come back, all emerge, but this is not going to necessarily be a growing hive. It could be a doomed hive. They may have swarmed. Brood has emerged. There is no queen, and there's not going to be one. Or they could be a mature hive. So I should have added startup, queenright, and they're ready. So you're getting the idea. Just looking without pulling frames doesn't give you the information you need about what phase your hive is in. And you know the background story. Like you installed your hive on a certain day. That it's been a month since you installed it. What you might not know is whether or not back in startup mode, whether or not they swarmed. And that's not this talk. This talk is to convince you about inspecting and planning and thinking ahead to what those frames of capped brood mean when you have a queenright hive. The week before I talked a lot about managing for swarming. I'll probably revisit it later, but this is what we get this time. All right, let's look at some numbers here. Installed a nuke on May 5th. You'll have 5 frames covered with bees, and it will also come with 3 frames that have brood. In about 2 weeks, when the foragers are going out, you're gonna lose a percentage of them, about 2 frames worth, 2 frames covered with bees. you'll gain 6 frames covered with bees. Where did those come from? Well, when the bees are sitting in their cells, they occupy half the space as when they emerge. So every frame of brood becomes covered with bees. All right, let's do the math. You'll now have May 19th, 2 weeks later, 9 frames of bees. She's really taken off. She's got 3 for the brood. But in 2 weeks, you'll lose 4 frames and gain 12. So this becomes, and we're just going to skip to the chase here, June 3rd, 17 frames of bees. June 17th, strangely enough, there's another 17, 23 frames of bees. So this is going to mean on May 19th, when you saw that hive with all those frames of bees, you needed to know what those frames of brood would mean for the next 2 weeks. You needed to know, put a box on, because this is 17, this is bigger than your deep. And what will happen is they'll just swarm on you. And then when you see both boxes on bees and there's a lot of brood on June 3rd, it's time for honey super. They might not even be bringing in honey, but they need the room. All right, stop the chain because we're going to take a step back. Let's say you have a startup hive. They're not queenright yet because they swarmed. Fifth, they have 5 frames covered with bees. Then May 19th, oh, they swarm. Right after they have 9 frames of bees. You inspected May 19th. On May 20th, you didn't know, they swarmed. Okay, this means on June 3rd, you're back east quite a bit. Why? Well, you had all this brood that emerged, but on June 3rd, there's no more brood coming on. But they're still losing bees. By June 17th, you're back to the size you were on May 19th, a month ago. And that's if she's back and started to lay. Sometimes she doesn't. So these changes are fairly subtle. I mean, it's not like the bees are on one frame. They're partially on the frames, and they tend to cluster towards the top. So just counting frames isn't always super helpful. But being aware that seeing that 50s can be deceptive. You can't just pop the top. Look at all those frames of bees, close it up. Yeah, that's not going to give you the information you need. Is this a hive on June that's going to need honey supers by June 17th? Well, no, actually, because their population is contracting. You're wasting your time if you do that. Just a little comparison here on what's happening on these dates. You got a hive that June 3rd looks pretty similar for both phases of your hive in its life. But what you do next, you need to know the actual what phase the hive is in, and the only way to know that is by pulling frames. In this case, you're going to pull frames. You're going to see cat brood. You're going to see eggs and larvae. You're not going to see queen cells or nectar in the center of the brood nest. Here, you might see the end of the cat brood, but you will not see larvae. You will not see eggs. You'll see nectar in the center of the brood nest, in the names that are in the center of the hive. And then that tells you this hive is on notice because they might become doomed. And by June 17th, the population will dwindle more, even if they're queenright and they have brood coming on. Now, I got to tell you, finding those first frames of eggs is really challenging. One of the best tricks you can do, and you can learn to do, is if you are at this point, you see, oh, look at all these bees, man. Both boxes are full. Oh, there's no eggs or larvae. One of the best things you can do is find a hive that does have eggs and larvae, or find somebody who knows how to graft into a queen cup and they can give that to you, and test your hive. Put that in your hive. It's a test. If they're in the phase where they're a startup and they're not queenright yet, but they're on the way, they will take those eggs and larvae and feed them and raise them as worker bees. If they were on the path to doomed and there was no chance at queen, well, they will then draw out queen cells, maybe 3, maybe 10. Check in about 5 days after you put in that frame, and you better pinch some of those queen cells and leave 1. Otherwise, they might swarm again. All right, where does inspecting come in? So, critical question. You need to know the last known date that you saw eggs and larvae. Wait, I didn't say saw the queen, did I? No, I'd prefer to not see the queen. I don't want her to be on the frames I pull out. Under those frames, I prefer to see eggs and larvae. Okay, some of us have older eyes. Here's a way to find eggs. You have a frame. You put it in, like this is a growing hive. It's there. The frames are getting drawn out. You're following my advice, and you're putting undrawn frame brood nest, one frame at a time, about every 5 days. Well, you see one, and it's got this yellow tint. Nice white comb from the sugar syrup, yellow tint. Eggs are in there. I don't know why, but they coat the cells with. In a day, it's going to become a larvae. Well, in that day, they'll be able to draw that cell out. Isn't that cool? All right. Oh, I don't know. I included this one because the queen is on. It was in the center of the brood nest. I knew they would draw it out. I'm not even feeding this hive. There's such a huge flow. It's like cramming the hives of nectar. And there she was. It was very convenient. I marked her. All right, second way, larvae. Okay, especially in a new hive. This is a patch of capped brood. The white out here. Well, she laid the capped brood. She started laying her eggs right here. And that was about, based on, see how they're just capping it? Cap it at day 9 after the egg was laid. So this is at like day 10. This stuff's like day 9. This is like day 8. And then out at the edges here, you might have day 7. Stuff that was laid 7 days ago. Ooh, tired of talking, apparently. I never get tired talking about bees, though. So let's do a close-up here. This is looking at a section where this is where the capped brood is, towards the top of the frame. And you can see how fat these larvae are. They're about to be capped. And as you go out, the larvae get younger. This hive, the queen, is not laying eggs quickly. You have 9-day-old larvae, 10-day-old brood over here, and you've got 3 here. So she's taken 6 days to lay up this frame. So, oh boy, it'd be nice if I knew what hive was, because that's kind of slow. But for a queen who's maybe 2 weeks old, 3 weeks old, that's acceptable. For a queen that's older than 3, if she has plenty of room to lay and the bees have room to move that nectar out, oh, this is a little too slow. So that's something. If you see eggs and then older larvae and then older larvae and then just being capped, she's taking her sweet time to fill the frame up. Now you might see and see capped and then let's see here. So she would have laid these in. So the center of the frame is open and has eggs in it. And the outer parts of the frame, as the bees are emerging, the queen's filling it up as fast as they're emerging. So that is another thing you can look for. And see, when the bees are filling up the brood nest, you'll see the shiny, not milky. So that's even if you can't make out you can still tell if it's milky. And by you, I mean me. All right. Last known date. You saw eggs and larvae. That's the last known date. The queen was, the hive was in the phase of either they're a startup and they're growing, or and is there capped brood? If they're queenright today, and they were last 2 weeks, yeah, there's capped brood. You go through every single frame to find and count the capped brood. You can count on there being capped brood. But you can count on it if you took notes that last week you saw a frame of capped brood and a frame of eggs and larvae next to each other, and this week you see the same thing. You're getting a continuous eggs and larvae, and thus population 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, because bees emerged 21 days after the. So just gotta really, really respect a frame of capped brood is 2 frames covered with bees, and the queen can lay up a frame in 3 days. So this means in 2 weeks, you can have 5 frames of brood emerge, which becomes 10 frames covered with bees, a whole deep box. So inspecting gives you the ability to predict how much room you will need, okay? So if you're queen right now, 2 weeks, 10 more frames of bees. So when you are looking at the hive now, you're picturing yourself, you can learn to picture yourself in 2 weeks. What are you going to need during those 2 weeks? You're going to need another box. So then you know if they're part of the way there, you should be adding another box, because in 2 weeks they'll actually need it really badly. So, and some of this depends on the phase the hive is in. If they're growing and they cover like 8 frames now and there's only 3 frames of brood, well, you could add another box, but they're not going to fill it very much. But you better not wait very long. All right, eventually, the hive will max out in its population. So a mature hive, we're continuing on from the prior phase before mature hive, which is startup. In this case, we're not talking about an overwintered hive. We will definitely talk about that. I'm going to continue these in December or January, because you got to be ready for an overwintered hive. Because this is basically like April 30th. How you're, well, okay, maybe not April 30th. Maybe May 10th. This is how your hive looks if you overwinter. But this is the phase where the hive is transitioned from they're a startup, they're growing, to they're becoming consistent population. They have 30 frames of bees. They have 5 frames with brood, and in 2 weeks they're going to lose 10 frames of bees. What? Yeah. When they are little sisters, it really shortens their lifespan. And if that 30 frames of bees, you pinch the queen, you pinch all the queen cells, you prevent them from getting a queen, they will stay at least 2 boxes of bees for probably most of the summer. Because if they're not feeding they live a lot longer. So that can be deceptive if you're just looking at the hive population. Gotta see those eggs and larvae. Okay, so when would you have needed supers? Clearly June 30th is too late. All right, let's review. On May, clearly they're just going to be in 1 deep. And by the time you get to May 19th, they're at 9 frames of bees, they have brood. Oh, you better put on a box. By the time you get to June 3rd, you see those 17, they're filling up the 2 boxes. They got brood coming on. Oh yeah, this is when you put the super on, June 3rd. Even they may not even start to make honey until after this span, when they really start to be big enough to occupy. Well, they're barely big enough to 23 2 deeps and a little bit into the supers. But by June 30th, yeah. When will they draw out the super? You need to really have an ongoing flow. Mother Nature can provide this sometimes. I can't believe this. It must have been 10 days or less. They drew out the super and just about filled it with honey. Now I have shallow supers, but when the flow is strong, they can do that. This year, I have enough drawn comb for about 3 hives, for 3 supers of drawn comb. And I have 15 hives, so I need 2 supers minimum drawn out for each hive. 3. If I was running mediums, I'd be okay with 2, but I'm running shallow, so I need 3 supers drawn out with comb to do anything at all. Even feed sugar syrup and then extract that funny honey for my personal use, if I have to do that. One of the things I'm doing now to try and optimize this condition, I am actually double coating the honey super foundation. If you add another layer of wax, especially if that layer is kind of crumbly, so I'm not aiming for a painted smooth layer, I want it to be kind of roughed up a little. I use a foam paint roller for that. And if you use a brush, just go like quick enough that you're catching the ridges of the foundation rather than getting a lot of wax down, and to kind of go a little faster and like watch. So that can actually really help them be encouraged to draw out the honey super. Another thing to realize, they're going to draw out from the center of the honey super, and sometimes it's worth taking those outer frames, and when they're most of the way through drawing out like 4 of the honey super frames, go ahead and put those outer frames in towards the center of the honey super, and then they will also get drawn out better. Okay, I'm so desperate to get all this comb drawn. It's not that I'm totally greedy for honey. It's because I looked at my hives in beginning of April. They were pretty darn full of bees because, they already had 5 frames of bees. They already had gained 4 frames from, so my hives have extra long frames. They're 12 and 3/4 inch. So it's equivalent to a deep and a medium, but as one. So they went through winter with about 4 frames covered with bees. Beginning of April, they had about 10 bees, and they had cat brood, a lot of cat brood. And I said, whoa, good thing I have some supers with drawn comb. I actually had to stagger the drawn foundation because, and some foundationless, which was a little messy, because I didn't have more. And the flow was so strong in early May from the dandelions. Oh my gosh, they drew comb. Even though beginning of May, as you might recall, we had some spells of snow, hard, free. Yeah, they drew comb. Almost a couple hives, it was almost a super's worth. It was an intense flow. Maybe part of the reason so many people had swarming. Okay, skip that page. All right, we're going to reset here a little bit. We've just been talking about population. We've just been talking about the great things about us. Now we're transitioning to the hard part about having bees. These are mites. This is the bottom of a plastic 6 inches tall. So on my screen, it's just about life size, actually. If your screen is like a laptop screen, it'll be just about life size. I could probably fit like 8 mites across my fingertip, maybe. So just to give you a sense, they're like crumbs. You can see them. And the reason, okay, this is actually a movie. This is really weird. This is a bottom board, and here's a twig, and it's probably a third the thickness of my finger. For whatever reason, this mite was...
Here's that moving mite again. Right
I don't know
there.
why. It did this for many minutes. This is a bottom board post-oxalic acid vaporization. Some of these crumbles are close to the size of a pollen basket that's full. This is actually a little smaller than that. It's all fell after the treatment, and I counted them just to have a sense. You can see mites are fairly agile. They can move around. They can move around if they're on a flower and a bee comes to visit that flower. People in mite transmission that way.
I did OAV.
So mites are not going to fall down onto the screen, through the screen bottoms like magically, never make it back up. They can climb back up, no problem. So screen bottom board really isn't going to reduce your mite pressure nearly as much as you need. Okay. How do mites kill hives? Okay, we're going to talk briefly about homegrown mites. So you get your package or your nuke, and it turns out they already had a sizable mite population. They had 100. Wait, what? 100 mites can be tremendous. Because in May, you have 100 mites. In June, you have 200. In July, you've got 400. August, 800. September, 1,600. October, now we're up to 3,000 mites. Your overwintering population is probably going to be about a deep, so that's 20,000 bees. Because each frame holds about 10,000 bees when it's, each frame holds about 2,000 bees. So add that up, 20 frames, all covered with bees. And you're going to go through with, really it's going to be 1 deep by the time you get to end of October. Well, 1/3 of them now are being sucked on by mites. And with that 3,000 mites, a lot of brood, a high percentage of that winter brood was being compromised. And that's where homegrown mites are killer. They compromise the brood that emerges and becomes baby bees because they were being sucked on as pupae, and they don't live as long. And if they don't live as long up in the nowhere, they don't make it. They don't make it through March and through April, because bees to forage and feed their little sisters in April. There will be bees emerging in April from the queen who started laying. She really doesn't start to lay substantial starts, which will be like the beginning of March, sometimes mid-March. If it's mid-March, you get functional flying bees from what she laid mid-April. it takes at least 3 weeks for bees to be able to fly and forage after they emerge. So that in the north, we cannot tolerate 100 mites in the beginning of. Okay, so that's bad. So at Chickabid's apiary, your nuke, I mean, you could do OAV, oxalic acid vaporization, when you get your nuke or your package and see how many mites drop. And you might get 10, maybe 5. Because I really work hard in fall and winter to strip down that mite population. That's going to lead us to mites that are imported in the fall, because you can see from the progression I just described, oh, well, kick the mite's butt in August. Beginning of August, do a treatment. Well, that leads us to the second way that mites kill hive. Okay, oh, you know what? I'm going to go back here. I'm going to talk about this for a minute. Okay, here's something crazy. I had 13 hives last year. I started treating with oxalic acid vaporization, which kills 95% of the mites on the bees' bodies. I had a hive that had 50 drop. That's how many grew in the hive since I treated them in December, well, let's say January of 2019. So in October 2019, 50 mites grew from the 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 that were in there. And all these hives had brood breaks because I went from 8 to 13 honey makers plus 6 over the course of one summer. So that's a lot of brood breaks. But it's also a lot of brood emerging into the spectrum. I had a number of hives with 1,500 to 2,000 mites that dropped after the first treatment, and then had another 1,000 or 800 or 500 drop after the second and third treatments. So what's going on here? Did I just do a crap job of managing my mites? Well, that is possible. They were higher than I thought. Remember, we were just doing the math. Starting with 100 mites, you can get to 3,000. No problem. But wait a second. After the first treatment, I should have killed 90%, 95% of the mites. So if 2,000 dropped, I killed 95% of the mites. There should only be like 200 mites left. How could I get a drop after that first treatment? Well, maybe some brood emerged or something. Got a better case for these imported mites, though. Up the way. Mite count of 0 out of 300 bees. There are no mites in his mite sample. He had 4 hives. One was new, 2 swarmed, so then he got a 4th hive. He did max, which is formic-based treatment, like a vapor treatment, in like September. His hives had over mites drop for each hive over the course of 3 OAV treatments. They were clean as a whistle, and they still each dropped 3,000 mites, 12,000 total in his apiary. I know which hives those came from. And that guy's my buddy now. And I treat his hive with oxalic acid vaporization. In fact, I gave him a nuke. I said, hey, I like my bees. I want those drones flying from here. I'm going to give them another one. I'm going to treat them. And this will never happen again from those hives. Okay, imported in the fall. This is a serious killer. We don't understand why this kills the bees, because these mites are feeding on the adults. They are not feeding on any brood. They came in too late to go into the brood. Imported in the fall is a huge percent of hives die in Ohio. And in the South, it's not as bad because they have pollen coming in for like all but a month, maybe. So the queen can make up for their losses. So the pressures in the South are they're just lower compared to up in the North. All right. So there are 2 theories about preventing your hive dying from mites. Mites is pneumonia. It's important. If you are thinking you have pneumonia, you know what? I should have said sinus infection. Let's pretend I said sinus infection. If you have a sinus infection, you don't immediately get antibiotics. If you have pneumonia, you always get antibiotics like right away. So you don't get antibiotics to prevent pneumonia. That's a good way to look at that. You don't get antibiotics to prevent pneumonia, but once you have pneumonia, you take antibiotics. to test to see if you have pneumonia or if it's a virus that's going to go away on its own, right? No point in giving somebody antibiotics if they don't have an actual bacteria that can be killed by it. So no point in doing a treatment for mites because you might be building resistant mites if you don't have mites. Okay, that's fine. There's another way to look at mites. This is how I look at the varroa mite. I think of them as influenza. Every year you can get a vaccine for influenza. And every year the strain changes. So the pressure on your body from the virus is going to be consistent. It's always going to be out there somewhere. It's going to be different every year. So a vaccine protects you every year. One vaccine is not going to protect you for all of the future years because you're going to encounter at some point the flu, most likely. So we're just going to leave aside politics, discussions, considerations, opinions about whether or not you should get the vaccine. That's actually, this is just a thought experiment about looking at mites as influenza and you have an effective, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So I look at mites as influenza. I would prefer to get the vaccine than the flu, and my body doesn't seem to have trouble with the vaccine. So this means you can ask this question: is detecting necessary? Is checking for mites necessary? Well, I check for mites in May. Well, I missed it this year. So June, I'm testing my theory that I should have 300 bees. If I have more than that, I consider that to be an emergency. So I test my strongest hives and longest because they will have built up the biggest population of mites. Is detecting necessary? Well, for me, it's necessary that this immunization theory is working, that I successfully immunized my hives in the fall and the winter from both the homegrown mites that may have built up over the summer, killed those, and from the influx of mites. So, test in August. It is possible that a hive could have collapsed in August and my bees found that hive and were robbing. Typically, the collapse doesn't happen until after flying weather ends, consistent flying weather ends, and we start to get into, 2 weeks with no flight in October, and then you have a fly day. A week with no flight, and then you'll get 3 fly days. That's when this influx seems to be happening. So you have to keep in mind, if you do an alcohol wash or a powdered sugar shake, and you get 3 mites in 300, I don't know why we do per 3, just do a percent. That's 1%. That's a third to a fifth the actual mite count. You actually have 5% mites. 5% of the bees are impacted by mites if you have 1%, potentially. If you have a 1%, 3 out of 300 mites in your 300 bee sample. In powdered sugar, you should probably double these because the powdered sugar method does not. I think there are some good numbers on it. My rule of thumb is I assume it's half as effective. If you have 0 mites or 1 mite in 300, the powdered sugar shake, it's got that 1 mite in 300. So you might actually have 1 mite, you got 0, but that's not a big deal. If you come up with 2 mites with a powdered sugar shake, you probably would have come up with 4 mites with the alcohol wash. And now we start to see a difference a little bit. Okay. So this is something, if you let all of the brood, you got a 1% mite count, you let all of the brood emerge, you would end up with a 5% mite count because so many mites were hiding under their brood cappings. Okay. This information, I cannot detect mites in September and October from an alcohol wash. I'm sorry. I have so few days that are good weather sometimes. It's not going to happen. Plus, I'm risking killing the queen or injuring the queen. Not happening. So for people who have winter, September and October mite wash is very challenging. You're not going to be able to let your mite counts were sufficiently impacted by your August treatment. Sorry, sometimes. Now, here's another way to look at detecting mites. Is it going to change what you do? I'll tell you what. If I find more than 0 mites and 300 bees in my strongest hive, I am going to treat that hive, and I'm going to treat every hive in my apiary. Honey production stops for the 20 minutes that I put physically in the honey supers in the hive. This is a big major production. Honey supers are kind of heavy. Actually, I would just take them off for 20 minutes. They would be okay. Oh, and I would actually do it every 5 days because oxalic acid vaporization kills mites that are on the bees. It doesn't kill any of the mites underneath the brood cappings. They're going to emerge in 5 days, and so I'm going to have to do all this again on top of all my other management, but I'm going to look because it will affect my management decisions. The same thing for an August mite check. More than about 3 or 4, I'm going to, well, I probably more like 10. I don't know. I haven't done all that many. Didn't have that many hives that grew through August last year. So I got 3 out of 300 for a hive that probably had swarmed and thus had less brood. But I decided to let it go because I would get excited about 15 mites in 300 in August. But since I know I'm going to be treating soon, I don't worry too much. 15 out of 300. Oh, sweet Jesus, 3%. Right? No, 5%. Yes. Okay, treatment options. If you have no idea of the mite levels, you really just cannot, you can't do the testing. You have a growing hive with brood. What should you do? Okay. If you have a new queen, do not use the Formic products, Max and Formic Pro. Just, it can really toast a queen. Like, we'll have days where, and then the next day is going to be 85, next day is going to be 95. You're not going to have a 7 to 10 day period with temperatures below 80, which is what you really need for Max. So Apivar, new queen, just, you have to use Apivar. If you're growing honey, well, you're not going to see the face of the hive. There's no point in having a honey in a hive that has a new queen. Their population's going to be going down a little bit. They're not going to have new brood that's emerging. Oh, well, not necessarily. You might have requeened the hive. If you put a new queen in and they had a strong queen before, or for some reason you took her out, you put a new queen in, then yeah, you might have a strong hive that's making honey. Well, Apivar means you can't make honey with that hive. So that's tough. That's tough. Oxalic acid vaporization, not the dribble, but vaporization. You can do that if you take the honey supers off for 20 minutes. So that doesn't have a new queen, that has a queen that overwintered or was born at least 2 months ago. If it has honey supers on, yeah, 2 months ago, about the youngest you'd expect a hive, and that's with all drawn comb and beautiful flow. Yeah, a lot of ifs there. You can use that might toast your queen. Your hive will be able to recover. Okay. Here's a different situation. You have no way to test. You don't have any brood. Apivar is a good choice. Oxalic acid vaporization or oxalic acid dribble. You're going to have to go to my website, chickabuzz.com, to find out more about how they work, because it's really long and drawn out. I'm just giving you the names to Google. No brood. Yeah, those are all really good options. Apivar you can use with brood, actually. So I don't know why I put that in there. But typically, if there's not much brood, that means you're not getting honey. So that's why Apivar is a good choice. Okay, clean slate approach. This is what's called my mite treatment plan, which I think of more as vaccinating my hives. All right, it just means, it's very simple. I do oxalic acid vaporization in the fall. I do it at least 3 times. I'll start in beginning of October or end of September. About 2-3 weeks later, I'll do it again. What I'm looking for is a mite drop of 20 to 50. And I want to see that twice. I'm going to do a treatment around the beginning of November because you can get that final fly day in November and your hive can finally find a dying hive or get a dose of mites from a dying hive that's dying of mites. So a minimum of 3 treatments with oxalic acid vaporization. The wand is like $100. You can buy the oxalic acid in a little baggie, and that'll last 1 hive. There's other options if you're buying it in bulk. Savogran is the brand name. It's on my website, chickabuzz.com. If you go under surviving, getting your hive to survive under bees, you'll find the mite management stuff. Or you don't want to use oxalic acid vaporization. You don't want to buy the wand. You don't want to risk that vapor being inhaled and all that. You can use an Apivar strip first, around beginning of October or mid-September, and then oxalic acid dribble sometime in November, early November. If it's a 40-degree day and they're not flying, that's perfect. You have to get every seam of bees. It's a 60 inch per deep. If you learn how to just tip one deep and hold it up, and then you can access the seams between the bottom and the top, like you can see the bottom deep and you're just kind of tipping up. That's a good trick. This is a total pain in the patootie though, as you can imagine, because that top deep is extraordinarily heavy. It's going to be 80 pounds, 60 pounds dead weight, and sticky too. So yeah, if you want to skip OAV. Okay, this is all I have. I haven't figured out how to be able to watch the chat live. So, and if you emailed me, I missed your question because I was talking instead of looking at my email. But if you emailed me, I'll email you back. My email's on my website if you want to look there. And otherwise, you probably, if you're from my class, you have my other email. So happy bee watching, and please definitely think about your mite treatment plan and what you want to do. All right. That's it. That's all she wrote. I got to do end stream. Okay. Copy. Oh, well. If it was, I'm really sorry. And, oh, there's the chat. Oh, well. And I hope